The stone walls were 2 feet thick. They had to be, not to keep intruders out, but to keep the screaming in. Inside the convent of San Placido in Madrid, Sister Margarita knelt in darkness. Her hands were bound behind her back with rope so tight it had already cut into her wrists. Her mouth had been speaking for 3 hours straight, not prayers but confessions forced from her lips through methods the Holy Office called spiritual correction. This wasn't an interrogation room, it was a convent chapel. This wasn't a criminal, it was a nun who had dared to question her superior. And this wasn't the Middle Ages, this was 1628, 17 years after the King James Bible was published, 5 years after Shakespeare's first folio, an era we call the dawn of enlightenment. But inside those walls, enlightenment had never arrived. Inside those walls, silence was holier than truth, and a woman's voice, even in God's house, could be considered heresy. Sister Margarita's crime? She had witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. The abbess and the convent's confessor, a priest named Francisco Garcia Calderon, alone together after midnight. She had seen the abbess leaving his chambers. She had heard sounds that didn't match the vow of chastity both had sworn before God. And she had done the unthinkable. She had spoken about it to another sister. That was all it took. Within a week, Sister Margarita was no longer a faithful servant of Christ. She was possessed by demons, and that's what they called it when a nun's words threatened the system. Demonic possession, because the alternative, that she was telling the truth, was far more dangerous to acknowledge. Now, let me ask you something. When you think of medieval convents, what comes to mind? Peaceful gardens, women in habits tending to the sick, quiet devotion and candlelit prayer. That's the story we were taught, the sanitized version, the one that makes us comfortable. But here's what they don't teach you in those history books. Inside these so-called sanctuaries, the same institution that preached mercy perfected the art of silencing women. Because a nun who spoke out wasn't just disobedient. She was threatening the entire architecture of divine authority. She was corrupting the body of Christ itself. And the church had very specific methods for dealing with corruption. If you've ever wondered why certain stories vanish from history while others are told again and again, you're in the right place. Every view, every subscription helps pull one more voice out of the darkness that tried to swallow them whole. Now let's go deeper. Because what happened to Sister Margarita wasn't unique. It was standard procedure. To understand what happened to nuns who broke silence, you first need to understand what that silence protected. We romanticize convent life. We imagine women choosing spiritual devotion over worldly marriage. We picture them as brides of Christ, living in peaceful contemplation, removed from the corruption and violence of the secular world. The reality was nothing like that. Most nuns didn't choose the convent. They were sent there by families who couldn't afford dowries for marriage, by fathers who had too many daughters and not enough political alliances to negotiate, by husbands who wanted to be rid of wives without the scandal of divorce, by communities that needed somewhere to put women who didn't fit, the too intelligent, the too rebellious, the too inconvenient. Once inside, these women discovered that the convent wasn't a refuge from hierarchy. It was hierarchy in its purest, most absolute form. At the top sat the abbess. She wielded power that would make most secular rulers jealous. She controlled every aspect of convent life: who ate what, who slept where, who received visitors, who was allowed to read, write, or speak. She answered only to the bishop, and bishops rarely questioned the internal affairs of women's religious houses. It was beneath their concern. Below the abbess came the senior nuns, often from noble families, women who had brought wealth to the convent and expected privileges in return. Then came the choir nuns, women of middling status who had taken full vows. Below them, the lay sisters, servants really, who did the physical labor. And at the very bottom, the novices, young girls still in training, powerless and vulnerable. This was the latter. And on every rung, silence was the currency of survival. You didn't question the abbess. You didn't report what you saw. You didn't speak of abuse, of theft, of violations of the very vows that supposedly governed this holy space. Because speaking meant betraying the divine order. And betraying divine order meant you weren't just wrong. You were possessed. You were evil. You were the serpent in the garden. The church had codified this silence in canon law. When a woman took her vows, she swore obedience. Not obedience to God alone, but obedience to her abbess as God's representative on earth. To challenge the abbess was to challenge God himself. And the punishments for such challenges weren't suggestions. They were written into the rules that governed every aspect of monastic life. Let me read you something. This comes from the Rule of St. Clare, written in the 13th century and still enforced in convents across Europe well into the modern era. If any sister, at the instigation of the enemy, shall have sinned mortally against our form of life, and if, after being admonished 2 or 3 times by the abbess or other sisters, she does not amend, let her eat bread and water on the floor before all the sisters for as many days as she has been obstinate. And if it seems advisable to the abbess, let her be subjected to even greater punishment. Read that again. Greater punishment. What did that mean? The system wasn't broken. It was designed exactly as intended, to ensure that women, even those who had given their lives to God, remained voiceless. And if they dared to use their voices anyway, the consequences were immediate, brutal, and often permanent. Now let me show you what that looked like in practice. Her name was Sister Maria. The year was 1543. The place, a Franciscan convent in Valladolid, Spain. Sister Maria had a problem with numbers. Not that she couldn't count, quite the opposite. She had been educated before entering the convent, rare for a woman of her time. She could read, write, and calculate. And when she calculated the convent's accounts, something didn't add up. The convent had received substantial donations that year, wealthy families paying for their daughters' places, bequests from dying nobles seeking to buy their way into heaven, tithes from local churches. According to the ledgers, the convent should have been prosperous. But the nuns were starving. Their meals consisted of watered-down soup and stale bread. The dormitories were freezing because there was no money for firewood. The chapel roof leaked, and no repairs were being made. Meanwhile, Sister Maria noticed something else. The local bishop's palace had recently been renovated. New tapestries, new furniture, new gilded fixtures in his private chapel. She did what any reasonable person would do. She asked the abbess about the discrepancy. That was her mistake. 3 days later, Sister Maria was summoned to the chapter room, the formal meeting space where the entire community gathered for important announcements and disciplinary matters. She walked in to find every nun in the convent assembled. They sat in rows, faces blank, hands folded. At the front of the room stood the abbess, and beside her the bishop himself. The abbess spoke first. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. That made it worse. Sister Maria has succumbed to the sin of pride, she announced. She has placed her own judgment above that of her superiors. She has questioned the will of God as expressed through his appointed shepherds. This cannot be tolerated. Sister Maria tried to speak, to explain, to show the numbers that proved her concerns were legitimate. She was told to kneel. When she hesitated, 2 senior nuns grabbed her arms and forced her down. Her knees hit the stone floor hard enough that the sound echoed through the chamber. "You will confess your sin before God in this assembly," the abbess said. Sister Maria remained silent. That's when the punishment began. First came the ritual of public confession. When she refused to admit wrongdoing, the abbess read a prepared statement on her behalf, a litany of invented sins: pride, disobedience, rebellion against divine authority, spreading discord among the sisters, allowing the devil to work through her tongue. After each accusation, the assembled nuns responded in unison, "Deliver us from evil." Sister Maria knelt in the center of the room, surrounded by women she had lived with for 7 years, women she had prayed with, eaten with, worked alongside. And, one by one, they were required to walk past her and speak a condemnation. Sister Maria has allowed pride to enter her heart. Sister Maria has forgotten her vow of obedience. Sister Maria has brought shame upon this holy house. Some spoke the words mechanically, eyes averted. Others infused them with conviction, perhaps believing what they said, perhaps performing belief to protect themselves from similar judgment. A few whispered apologies as they passed, so quietly that only Sister Maria could hear, but they still spoke the words. When the last nun had taken her turn, the abbess produced scissors. In convents, a nun's hair was her vanity, even though it was hidden beneath her habit. Cutting it was symbolic, stripping away the last remnant of worldly identity. It was done once during the ceremony when a woman took her vows. After that, hair was allowed to grow again beneath the veil. But for Sister Maria, it was cut again, not carefully with ceremony and prayer, but roughly in chunks, pulled and sawed off while she knelt. Clumps of dark hair fell around her, and she was told she must leave them there, kneeling among her own scattered strands for the remainder of the day. Then came the robe. She was stripped of her regular habit and dressed in a garment made of rough burlap, brown and shapeless, marked with a red cross on the back. This was the robe of penance, and she would wear it for 6 months. Every time the other nuns saw her, they would be reminded of what happened to those who questioned authority. For those 6 months, Sister Maria ate her meals on the floor while the others sat at table. She was forbidden to speak, except during confession. She was assigned the most degrading tasks, cleaning the latrines, washing the soiled linens of sick nuns, scrubbing floors on her hands and knees while others walked past. But here's what makes this story truly chilling. This was considered a light punishment. Sister Maria was noble-born. Her family had connections. The abbess couldn't go too far without risking external intervention. Most nuns had no such protection. And for them, questioning authority meant facing something far worse than humiliation. This wasn't just punishment. This was theater. Every nun watching learned the same lesson: your sisters will not protect you. The community will devour you if you step out of line, and the system will use your body as a teaching tool for everyone else. Sister Maria survived her penance. She never questioned the accounts again. She lived another 32 years in that convent, dying in 1575. And in all those years, according to the convent records, she never spoke a word about what she had witnessed. The bishop's renovations, by the way, were never investigated. The money was never recovered, and the nuns continued to starve while their donations enriched the men who claimed to shepherd them. Now, let me show you what happened when nuns didn't have noble protection, when their voices were deemed so dangerous that humiliation wasn't enough. The year is 1592. The place, the convent of the Poor Clares in Nuremberg. 3 nuns, Sister Helena, Sister Margarita, and Sister Anna, came forward with a complaint. Their confessor, Father Wilhelm, had been making advances during confession. Not subtle, not ambiguous. He had touched them, propositioned them, told them that their vows of chastity didn't apply to relations with priests because priests were instruments of God's will. When they refused him, he told them they were rejecting God himself. The nuns did what they were supposed to do. They reported him to the abbess. The abbess did what she was supposed to do. She informed the bishop, and the bishop did what bishops had done for centuries. He protected the priest. Father Wilhelm was reassigned to another parish. A lateral move, no punishment, no investigation, no acknowledgement that he had violated sacred vows and secular law. But the 3 nuns who had reported him, they faced consequences. They were called liars, attention seekers, possessed by demons that made them imagine improper thoughts and then project them onto an innocent man of God. Their accusations were reframed as symptoms of their own spiritual sickness, and that sickness required treatment. The treatment was a device you might have heard of, the scold's bridle. In secular society, it was used on women deemed too talkative, too quarrelsome, too unwilling to accept male authority. An iron cage locked around the head with a spiked plate forced into the mouth to suppress speech. But this wasn't secular society. This was a convent, a place supposedly devoted to mercy and salvation. The bridles were fitted to all three women on the same day. The process was supervised by the abbess and witnessed by Father Wilhelm himself, who stood in the corner of the room praying loudly for the demons to be cast out. The device consisted of an iron framework that encased the entire head. It locked at the back of the neck with a mechanism that required a key. The front piece pressed against the forehead and cheeks, and inside, a flat piece of metal shaped like a tongue depressor, covered in small spikes, was inserted into the mouth. When the mouth was closed, the spikes pressed against the tongue, not hard enough to pierce immediately, but enough to cause constant pain. Any attempt to speak, to swallow, even to move the tongue naturally, drove the spikes deeper. Blood would fill the mouth. The choice was simple: remain absolutely still and silent, or suffer. Sister Helena, Sister Margarita, and Sister Anna wore these devices for 3 days. They were placed in the chapel, still wearing the bridles, and told to contemplate their sins. Other nuns were required to walk past them hourly as a reminder of what happened to those who bore false witness. The 3 women couldn't eat, couldn't drink, couldn't close their mouths fully because the metal framework prevented it. Drool and blood ran down their chins and stained their habits. The sounds they made, small animal whimpers of pain when they accidentally moved, echoed off the chapel walls. On the 3rd day, Sister Anna collapsed. She had lost so much fluid from the bleeding and the inability to swallow that her body simply shut down. For an hour, she lay on the chapel floor while nuns stepped over her on their way to prayer. Finally, the abbess allowed her to be carried to the infirmary. The bridles were removed that evening. Sister Margarita and Sister Anna recovered, though Sister Margarita lost 3 teeth that had been loosened by the constant pressure. Sister Helena developed an infection in her mouth that spread to her throat. She died 6 weeks later. The official record stated she died of natural causes. Fever, God's will. Father Wilhelm continued his work. Records show he served as a confessor to 4 more convents over the next 20 years. No other accusations were ever filed against him. Not because there were no other incidents. Because the 3 women who had dared to speak became legends. Cautionary tales whispered among nuns who understood exactly what their voices were worth. The message was surgical in its precision. The very organ of speech, the tongue, must be disciplined, controlled, made to bleed if necessary. And if you died in the process, that was proof that the demons had won. That you were never worth saving in the first place. But if you think devices like the scold's bridle represent the worst of what happened to nuns who spoke out, you're not ready for what comes next. Because there was a punishment that didn't end after hours or days or months. A punishment that lasted years, sometimes decades. A punishment where death would have been mercy. They called it in pace, in peace. Let me explain what that actually meant. Imagine a cell, not a prison cell with bars and a window. I mean a chamber carved into the thick stone walls of a convent. 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, barely tall enough to stand. No window, no natural light. Just stone on all sides and a ceiling so low you'd have to hunch if you wanted to stand at all. Now, imagine being led into that cell, hands bound, flanked by other nuns who avoid your eyes because they know what's about to happen and they're terrified it might be them next. You're told to step inside, and then they brick up the entrance. Not with a locked door, not with iron bars you might someday hope to escape. With actual bricks and mortar, sealing you inside like you're already dead. The only opening is a small slot, maybe 8 inches by 6 inches, through which food and water will be passed, and another smaller hole near the floor for waste. This was in pace, perpetual penance, living burial, and it was a legal sentence that abbesses could impose on nuns who committed what the church called grave spiritual crimes. What constituted a grave spiritual crime? Repeated disobedience, writing without permission, corresponding with people outside the convent, teaching other nuns to question doctrine, refusing imposed silence, and yes, reporting abuse by clergy when that abuse was deemed unproven or exaggerated or the product of demonic imagination. The convent of San Domenico in northern Italy, 1720s. Sister Antonia was 52 years old. She had lived in the convent since she was 14, 38 years of service, prayer, and work. She had also been writing letters to the Vatican, to cardinals, to anyone who might listen. In those letters, she described how the local bishop was extorting money from the convent, demanding payments in exchange for confirming new abbesses, threatening to shut down the convent entirely if the nuns didn't comply. She described how he visited late at night, how he had private meetings with young novices, how his spiritual guidance left some of those young women pregnant, sent away in shame while he remained untouched. Sister Antonia gathered evidence, copied financial records, collected testimonies from other nuns willing to speak confidentially. She compiled it all and sent letter after letter to Rome. None of them ever arrived. The bishop had friends in the postal system. The letters were intercepted, and eventually they were delivered right back to him. When he visited the convent that spring, he brought the letters with him, all of them, unread by anyone in Rome. He laid them out on the abbess's desk like evidence in a trial. Sister Antonia was summoned. She was given one chance to recant, to say the letters were lies, products of madness or demonic influence, to beg forgiveness from the bishop and promise never to speak of such things again. She refused. She looked at him directly, something women weren't supposed to do, especially not to male clergy, and said, "I have written only the truth, and I will continue to write the truth until someone listens." The bishop smiled, not with warmth, with something that looked almost like satisfaction, because she had just given him exactly what he needed. Within a week, Sister Antonia was tried by a tribunal consisting of the abbess, the bishop, and 2 visiting Jesuits. The charge, persistent defiance of ecclesiastical authority, undermining the sacred hierarchy, and susceptibility to demonic influence. The sentence, in pace, perpetual penance, to be sealed in a cell until such time as God saw fit to release her soul. The cell was prepared in the oldest part of the convent, in a section of the walls that dated back to the 12th century. The stone was cold even in summer, damp from centuries of moisture seeping through. Sister Antonia was led there on a Tuesday morning. The entire convent was required to witness, to see what happened to those who persisted in defiance. She walked calmly. Some accounts say she was praying. Others say she was silent, her lips pressed together, determined not to give her captors the satisfaction of tears or pleas. She stepped into the cell. It was empty except for a thin layer of straw on the floor and a wooden bucket in the corner. The last thing she saw was the faces of her fellow nuns, women she had lived with for decades, as the stonemason began laying bricks across the entrance. The work took about an hour. She could hear every brick being set, every trowel of mortar being spread. She could hear the light being sealed away, bit by bit, until only the small feeding slot remained. And then, silence. Sister Antonia lived in that cell for 12 years. Twice a day, a small portion of bread and watered-down soup was pushed through the slot. Once a day, someone emptied the waste bucket through the lower opening. No one spoke to her. No one was allowed to acknowledge her existence beyond these minimal biological necessities. She had no light, no books, no writing materials, no human contact, just stone and darkness and the sound of her own breathing. She developed tuberculosis in the 6th year, probably from the dampness and the lack of fresh air. The coughing could be heard in the dormitories above, echoing up through the walls at night. Some of the younger nuns didn't even know what the sound was. They hadn't been there when she was sealed in, and no one spoke of her. She died in 1734, alone in the dark. Her body was discovered in 1802, when the convent was being renovated and workers broke through a section of wall they thought was solid. They found the cell, and inside they found bones, a rotted habit, and something else, scratches on the walls, hundreds of them. She had used her fingernails or perhaps a small stone to mark the days, to count the time, to leave some proof that she had existed, that she had endured, that she had not simply vanished. The workers counted the marks. 4,380, 12 years, alone, in the dark. Her crime, writing the truth. Think about that. You are a bride of Christ devoted to God, and your crime is speaking truth. Your punishment is to be buried alive within the very walls meant to protect you, and outside the prayers continue. Mass is celebrated. New novices arrive and take their vows. Life goes on. You have been erased, and here's what makes this unbearable. These women weren't being punished by enemies of faith. They were being tortured by people who believed, truly believed, that breaking their bodies would save their souls. Now, let me show you what happened when speaking out was considered not just defiance, but heresy, when the punishment wasn't carried out by the convent alone, but by the full machinery of the Holy Inquisition. The doctrine was simple. Pain purifies. Suffering burns away sin. And if the body must be broken to save the soul, then breaking it becomes an act of love. This is how they justified what came next. Sister Magdalena de la Cruz was famous across Spain in the 1540s. She was a mystic, a woman who claimed to receive visions directly from God. People traveled hundreds of miles to seek her blessing. She performed healings, or at least people believed she did. She advised bishops, corresponded with nobility, became one of the most respected spiritual figures in the country. But then her visions changed. She began describing things that made the church uncomfortable. She spoke of corruption among the clergy, of priests who lived in luxury while their congregations starved, of bishops who sold salvation and hoarded wealth. She described heaven as a place where the poor and suffering would sit in judgment of the rich and powerful, where earthly hierarchies would be inverted. This was not the kind of mysticism the church wanted to promote. Sister Magdalena was summoned to appear before inquisitors in Córdoba. She went willingly, believing her visions were genuine, that she had nothing to hide. They asked her to recant, to say the visions were false, that she had invented them for attention or been deceived by demons. She refused. That's when the Inquisition employed what it called extraordinary measures. Torture. Not as punishment, but as a diagnostic tool. The logic was perverse but internally consistent. If Sister Magdalena's visions came from God, God would protect her during questioning. If she broke under torture, that was proof the visions came from demons. The first method they used was strappado. Her hands were tied behind her back and she was hoisted into the air by a rope attached to her wrists. The full weight of her body hung from her shoulders, dislocating the joints. She was held there for hours while inquisitors asked her questions. "Are your visions from God or from Satan?" "From God," she whispered through the pain. They dropped her suddenly, then caught her just before she hit the ground. The jolt sent new waves of agony through her shoulders and arms. They repeated this process over and over. When strappado didn't produce the confession they wanted, they moved to sleep deprivation. For 6 days, she was kept awake, propped upright in a chair while guards shook her every time she began to drift off. The human mind begins to break after just a few days without sleep. Hallucinations set in. Time becomes meaningless. Reality itself starts to fracture. On the fourth day, Sister Magdalena began describing visions again. But these were different, darker, more chaotic. The inquisitors recorded them carefully. "See," they said, "the demons are revealing themselves." When she still refused to recant her original visions, they subjected her to the rack. Her wrists and ankles were bound to a wooden frame, and the frame was slowly stretched. Not enough to kill, but enough to feel tendons tearing, joints separating, bones grinding against each other. She lasted 3 hours before she broke. "They were demons," she finally said. "All of it. Demons." The inquisitors recorded her confession. She was sentenced to life imprisonment in a convent cell. Not in pace, but close. A small room, locked and guarded, where she would spend the rest of her days in prayer and penance. Sister Magdalena lived another 15 years. She never spoke publicly again. And the Church used her case as proof that mystical women needed to be controlled, that female visions were inherently suspect, that any woman claiming direct access to God was probably being deceived by Satan. But here's what the records don't show. After her confession, after she was locked away, Sister Magdalena began writing again, in secret, on scraps of cloth smuggled to her by sympathetic nuns. She wrote that her confession had been false, that torture had forced words from her mouth that her soul rejected, that her visions had been real, and the Church had broken her body because it couldn't bear the truth those visions revealed. Those writings were discovered after her death and immediately destroyed. Only fragments survived, preserved in the letters of one nun who had helped smuggle the cloth. One fragment read, "They can break the body. They cannot break what God has shown me." And here's what makes this story even more chilling. Sister Magdalena de la Cruz wasn't unusual. She was one of dozens of mystic women across Europe who faced inquisitorial torture when their visions became inconvenient. When their access to God threatened the monopoly the Church claimed on divine truth. Some recanted and lived. Some refused and died. But all of them learned the same lesson. In the battle between a woman's voice and institutional power, the institution would sacrifice any number of bodies to maintain control. Now, you might be thinking, surely these are extreme cases. Surely most nuns who spoke out just faced minor punishments and lived to old age. You'd be wrong, because there was one final punishment, rare but documented, that the Church reserved for those it deemed completely irredeemable, for women whose voices were so dangerous that even perpetual imprisonment wasn't enough. Execution. Sister Maria de Cazalla lived in Spain during the 1530s, at the height of the Spanish Inquisition. She was part of a religious movement called the Illuminists, people who believed that humans could have a direct, personal relationship with God without the need for priests or church mediation. This was considered the most dangerous kind of heresy, because if people didn't need the church to access God, what was the church for? Sister Maria preached this doctrine to other women. She taught them to pray directly to God, to trust their own spiritual experiences, to question whether confession and communion and all the rituals of the church were truly necessary for salvation. She was arrested in 1532. The charges against her filled 18 pages, teaching heretical doctrine, encouraging others to reject ecclesiastical authority, claiming that faith alone, not works or sacraments, could save the soul, undermining the sacred mystery of the priesthood. Her trial lasted 3 years. During that time, she was tortured repeatedly. The same methods used on Sister Magdalena: strappado, sleep deprivation, the rack. But Sister Maria de Cazalla had something her sister in suffering didn't: connections. Her brother was a military officer. Her family was minor nobility. Those connections saved her life, barely. She was forced to recant publicly, to denounce everything she had taught and everyone she had taught it to. She was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of her life, forced to wear the San Benito, a penitential garment that marked her as a convicted heretic. She lived 15 more years, never allowed to leave her home, never permitted to teach or preach or even speak to visitors without a church-appointed monitor present. But others in her movement weren't so fortunate. At least 11 other women associated with the Illuminists were executed between 1529 and 1540. Some were burned at the stake, the traditional punishment for heresy. Others were garroted first, strangled to death before the fires were lit, a mercy granted to those who recanted at the last moment. The executions were public spectacles held in town squares, designed to terrify anyone who might be tempted to follow similar paths. The accused were paraded through streets in penitential garments, forced to listen as their crimes were read aloud to jeering crowds. Then they were tied to stakes. Wood was piled at their feet, and the fires were lit. It took between 15 and 20 minutes to die this way. Long enough to think. Long enough to scream. Long enough to realize that the institution you had devoted your life to had decided your voice was worth less than the smoke it would produce. These weren't isolated incidents scattered across centuries. These were features of a system that understood something most empires eventually learn. The most dangerous thing you can do to power is refuse to be silent. And for women in God's house, silence wasn't just expected. It was enforced with chains, with stones, with fire. But here's what the church didn't count on. Some voices refused to be silenced. Some women found ways to speak that the system couldn't stop. Saint Teresa of Avila is famous now, a doctor of the church, one of only 4 women to hold that title. But in her lifetime, she was investigated by the Inquisition multiple times. Why? Because she wrote. And in her writing, she criticized the corruption she saw in the church, the hypocrisy of clergy who claimed poverty while living in luxury, the superficiality of religious practice that focused on ritual instead of genuine spiritual transformation. She survived because she was brilliant at political maneuvering. She couched her criticisms in language of humility and obedience. She networked with powerful allies who could protect her. She played the game better than those who wanted to silence her. But it was close. Her writings were very nearly banned. Her reform efforts were almost destroyed, and she lived with the constant knowledge that one wrong word, one unprotected moment, could mean the end. Across the ocean, in New Spain, a woman named Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz used poetry to speak truths that prose would have gotten her killed for. She was an intellectual prodigy, a woman who taught herself Latin, philosophy, theology, science. She wrote plays, essays, poems that challenged the subjugation of women and defended their right to education and intellectual life. Her most famous work, Reply to Sor Filotea, was a defense of women's learning disguised as a humble letter. In it, she asked, if God gave women minds, why should they not be allowed to use them? It was a revolutionary question. The church's answer came swiftly. Sor Juana was ordered to stop writing, to sell her library of 4,000 books, to surrender her scientific instruments, to devote herself entirely to prayer and penance. She complied. What choice did she have? She died 2 years later, in 1695, while nursing other nuns during an epidemic. She was 43 years old. And then there's Sister Juana de los Angeles, who lived in France in the 1630s. She became famous for leading what history calls the Loudun possessions, a case where an entire convent claimed to be possessed by demons. The truth of what happened is still debated. Were they genuinely possessed? Was it mass hysteria? Or was it a performance, a way for Sister Juana to speak truths about abuse and corruption using the only language the church couldn't silence? Because when she testified during the exorcisms, she described things, abuse by priests, financial corruption, manipulation, that would have gotten her killed if she'd spoken them as herself. But as a woman possessed, the demons could say anything, and the church had to listen. Some historians believe Sister Juana used possession as a shield, a way to expose what she'd witnessed while maintaining plausible deniability. Whether that's true or not, we'll never know for certain. But we know this: she survived, she testified, and her words reached audiences that would never have listened to a simple nun making accusations. These women, Teresa, Sor Juana Inés, Sister Juana de los Angeles, found cracks in the system. They spoke through mysticism, through poetry, through the very language of devotion that was supposed to keep them silent. But for every voice that survived, 100 others were swallowed by silence. For every woman who found a way to speak and live, there were countless others sealed in walls, broken on racks, burned at stakes, erased from records and memory. Let me tell you something about institutional silence. It's not enough to stop a person's voice in the moment. The system has to make sure future generations never learned that speaking was even possible. That's why these stories weren't preserved in church archives. They were buried, redacted, destroyed. The records of Sister Antonia's trial? Burned. The testimonies of the nuns who wore scolds' bridles? Lost. The letters Sister Magdalena de la Cruz wrote from her cell? Deliberately destroyed. The institution that punished these women also controlled the narrative about them. And that's how power works. It doesn't just defeat you, it erases the evidence that you ever fought back. The stone walls of San Placido still stand in Madrid. Tourists walk past them every day, admiring the Baroque architecture, taking photos of the beautiful facade. Most have no idea what happened inside those walls. Most have never heard of Sister Margarita, or the accusations she made, or the torture she endured for speaking. But in 1971, a graduate student named Elena Sanchez was researching Inquisition records in the Toledo archives. She was looking for something completely different, economic data about convent landholdings, when she found a wooden box that had been misfiled. Inside were transcripts from the San Placido possession case of 1628, 37 pages of testimony from Sister Margarita, and 11 other nuns who had been accused of demonic possession after reporting sexual misconduct by their confessor. The transcripts described the torture methods used, the threats made, the confessions forced, and scattered throughout, in handwriting that grew more erratic as the pages progressed, were Sister Margarita's actual words, her persistent insistence that she had witnessed what she claimed, that her accusations were true, that she would not recant no matter what they did to her. The last page of the document contained a note from the inquisitor who had overseen the case. It read, "The accused has been successfully corrected through extraordinary measures. She has confessed to demonic influence and will be remanded to perpetual penance. This case is to be sealed." Sealed, hidden, forgotten. For 343 years, Sister Margarita's voice had been trapped in that box, in that archive, waiting for someone to find it. Elena Sanchez published the documents in 1974. The Catholic Church condemned the publication as sensationalistic and potentially damaging to interfaith dialogue. But the evidence was out. And once you know these stories exist, you can't unknow them. Every woman who questioned, who reported abuse, who demanded accountability, she knew what awaited her. She had seen it happen to others. She had watched women sealed in walls, broken on racks, burned at stakes. And she spoke anyway. That's not recklessness. That's courage most of us will never have to summon. Because here's the thing about speaking truth to power. It costs everything. Your safety, your community, often your life. The system is designed to make the cost so high that silence becomes the only rational choice. But some women refused to be rational. Some women decided that truth mattered more than safety, that bearing witness was worth the price. And if you think this is ancient history, ask yourself, How many institutions today still operate on the same principle? Silence is sacred. Questions are sin. The victim who speaks is treated as the criminal. We want to believe we've evolved past this, that we live in enlightened times where voices can't be silenced, where truth is valued over institutional protection. But every time a whistleblower is destroyed while the system they exposed continues operating. Every time someone reports abuse and finds themselves on trial instead of their abuser. Every time we collectively decide that preserving an institution matters more than acknowledging what it's done, we're using the same playbook the Church perfected centuries ago. The tools have changed. We don't use scold's bridles or in pace cells anymore, but the logic remains the same. Some voices are too dangerous to allow. Some truths threaten power too directly. And when those voices speak anyway, they must be destroyed as a lesson to everyone else. Sister Margarita understood this. So did Sister Antonia. So did Sister Maria de Cazalla and Sor Juana Inez, and all the others whose names we don't even know because they were erased so completely that not even fragments of their stories survived. They spoke knowing what it would cost, and they spoke anyway. The stone walls of convents across Europe are filled with their ghosts. Women who died in darkness, alone, their voices swallowed by institutions that claimed to represent God. But those voices didn't vanish. They're carved into stone where no one thought to look. They're hidden in letters that survived by accident. They're waiting in archives that historians are only now beginning to excavate. And every time someone finds one, every time a researcher discovers a document that was supposed to have been destroyed, every time a story resurfaces that was meant to stay buried, those voices speak again. Sister Margarita was right. They can take your voice. They can seal you in walls, break you on racks, burn you alive, but they cannot take the truth you speak. That truth survives. In fragments, in whispers, in the cracks the system couldn't quite seal. And now you know it too. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you wonder what else history is hidden, then do something with that feeling. Hit subscribe, share this video, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what voice from history you want uncovered next. Because these women were silenced once. Let's make sure it doesn't happen twice. There are more stories like this, stories that power tried to bury, voices that institutions worked for centuries to erase, and we're going to keep digging them up, one archive at a time, one forgotten document at a time, one voice at a time. Because the most dangerous thing we can do, the thing power fears most, is remember. Remember what they did. Remember who paid the price. Remember that silence was never about holiness. It was always about control. The next video is already waiting. Another story they didn't want you to know. Another voice they tried to silence. Another truth that survived anyway. Click it, watch it, share it. Because once you see how systems of power really work, you can't unsee it, and you shouldn't. This is where we uncover what history tried to forget. Welcome to the darkness. Let's bring some light.